So let's start and make sure that you don't take everything for granted what I'm going to say today. So nevertheless, I'm not sure how you feel currently. I personally feel currently, because of the situation, kind of angry, kind of pissed sometimes, and this probably reflects during this talk as well. So let's talk about eating the rich. Um, really or really eating the rich? So why am I actually stating that out? So what is happening at this moment? And obviously, for the first time in human history, the stability of nature and civil society can no longer be taken for granted. And despite years of activism, the world is slowly getting worse. Just think about the ozone layer or glaciers meltdown. However, currently, the pandemic has actually accelerated many trends. Like, for example, within health, telemedicine has increased, or jobs, distributed working, as I'm doing right now, is becoming more ubiquitous. Education and the rise of online learning is definitely on the rise. Nevertheless, and the pandemic is also revealing the depth of our economic and social inequality. So when you look at health, the access to healthcare is still highly uneven. Jobs, low-income people have lost jobs and income. And from an educational sense, out-of-school children face greater risks. So that's why I wanted to talk to you and share my thoughts on the topic around from actually shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism and beyond. And I thought about a lot of what kind of value I could bring to you. So allow me to look more into those things on a macro level and do a deep dive into the history of capitalism. You can play with this surely during your next days, and I won't give you any answers here. So please still think for yourself, and let's start. And I'm sure you expected that we actually start with someone like Jesus. So the criticism around capitalism is actually not as new. And as you can even read in the Bible, and I will read that out, and Jesus went into the temple of God and cast out all them that sold and bought in the temple, and overthrew the tables of the money changers and the seats of them that sold doves, and said unto them, it is written, my house shall be called the house of prayer, but ye have made it a den of thieves. So this is an original quote from the Bible. And you will see that on the wall of a church in Padua near Venice, the painter Giotto made a fresco called Expulsion of the Money Changers from the Temple, which exactly pictures what was stated out in the quote before. Jesus went into that temple of Jerusalem, saw merchants and small-time bankers crowding the forecourt, and got furious since he thought a sacred place is not a fitting arena for the polluting activities of buying and selling. So let's look a little further out at Venice in the year of 1450. Franciscan friar Luca Pacioli, and I hope Italians don't take it for granted, but I'm not pronouncing probably right, publishes the first ever book on accounting, which is called the Summa de Arithmetica. It's the single most important capitalist invention until the birth of a joint stock company and the modern factory. In this book, and you can download it, by the way, for free. It's available. Pacioli introduces the principle of double entry bookkeeping, which gradually becomes standard practice in all companies. Pacioli's textbook proposes that dealing well with money doesn't depend on faith anymore. Money isn't a divine punishment or reward. It's a kind of science that can be learned through patience, reason, and hard work. So let's have a look at how this further progressed down the timeline. In Geneva, at the year of 1555, the Protestant theologian John Calvin emphasizes to his Swiss audiences the importance of what has become known as the Protestant virtues. So basically, they're around hard work, self-denial, patience, honesty, and duty. For me personally, that doesn't sound too bad as virtues, but these will turn out to be extremely useful qualities for capitalism. And to quote Calvin, An original quote: "You must never indulge yourself, not spend money having a lavish life. You must simply put any surplus income back into your business as an investment." So Calvin adds that being good at business is far more pleasing in the sight of God than being an aristocratic warrior or even a monk, perhaps more than technology. It's this new mindset that will accelerate the progress of capitalism. So here you can see from my perspective, wonderful painting from Peter Boverman that shows the horse market of Delft within the Dutch Republic in the year 1670. The Dutch Republic is actually the world's first explicitly capitalist nation where lazy aristocrats are looked down upon and hardworking merchants revered. And you can see that in the arts of, because there was a shift from glorifications of kings and queens towards the picture on the right, on the left-hand side, which is Johannes Vermeer. He finishes the painting, The Lace Maker, which is a depiction of the intricate, carefully and homefully task of manufacturing lace. In his painting, The Little Street, on the other side actually, the suggestion is that living peacefully and quietly in your own home, running a business is far more glamorous and noble than fighting in a war or going to a monastery. And this view of capitalism continued until 1776. Here you can see a district called Strand in London. And these are the offices of shops, of a shop called Strain and Cable, which published a book called An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, which was written by a Scottish philosopher called Adam Smith. And Smith demystified wealth creation by explaining how capitalist economies grow. He reached several important conclusions. Let me show you one of those. And feel free to read it for yourself, because I think it's quite impressive what he said there. If you say something, I mean, it sounds very provocative nowadays, if you even raise the word slavery, but the meaning there is quite interesting at those early days. And if you look at the British economy rising, so around 1840, 54 in London, there were surely different opinions on capitalism out there. So the British economy at that time was the largest in the world, thanks to its enormous industries of cotton, shipbuilding, steel, and coal. And the newly rich capitalist class have triumphed. And people like Charles Dickens were actually quite furious about capitalism. So Charles Dickens, as one of Victoria's England's most passionate critics of unrestrained capitalism, published a novel called Hard Times, and it was set in the fictional times of Coketown, a version of Manchester. It aims towards heartless capitalists like Mr. Gradgrind, who abuses his workers, exploits young children in mines and chimneys. Dickens argues that capitalism is evil because it encourages appalling conditions for the producers. And it's as a continuation of critics in 1860, the English reformer John Ruskin published Unto This Last. It's actually a furious track against capitalism that takes aim not so much at the production side of capitalism as the area of consumption. Like Dickens, Ruskin is incensed that people are being exploited and the environment is ruined. And if you hear just the last sentence, like people are being exploited and the environment is ruined, that was 1860, it probably gives you a sense what happened not only last year and all the years before, but got more intense lately. So to quote him, money shouldn't be only made morally, it should be spent morally only on the truly noble and beautiful things that humans need. So he actually contrasts the beauty of Venice with the ugliness of modern Britain. And by the way, whatever is a noble thing to actually own. And as a transition, actually I like the transition between those two. And take a guess, I mean, this is Berlin 1963, and it's showing the leaders of the communist East Germany. And Walter Ulbricht launched an ambitious new scheme back then, and it was called Neues Ökonomisches System. You can later try to speak that out again and try the pronunciation. It aims to solve for East Germans the two major failings of capitalism in his eyes. And one, it will guarantee workers good conditions with a huge expansion in the number of state schools, holiday blocks, and holiday camps. Doesn't that sound marvelous? And secondly, it will focus not on the flipperies of capitalist production like blue jeans or pop music. It will give people the works of Plato and Marx and uplifting television programs about track to productions. Sounds super awesome. Or at the same time, also in the 70s, we had economists like Milton Friedman stating out the only social responsibility of business is to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profit, so long as it stays within the rules of the game, which is to say, engages in open and free competition without deception or fraud. It is surprising how different the world actually already was at that time. And if we look at Dresden also in the 70s, be warned, by the way, this is not a correct image. I don't know, I didn't find actually a true image from that time. But there was a massive riot about the unavailability of coffee. So the riot was about coffee. And it happened during that time in Dresden because East Germans actually love drinking coffee. But a huge rise in global prices meant that the German Democratic Republic could no longer afford to import the necessary quantities. So what they came up with was the Politburo decided to remove all coffee from shops and replaced it with the so-called Kaffee Mix, which is a mixed coffee, which is nicely 51% coffee and 49% range of fillers, including chicory, rye, and sugar beet. Actually, I have to drink a little bit of coffee now. So it's an inadvertent tribute to capitalism, which is especially good at providing us with life's little luxuries. And I'm not surprised that's why I had to show you an image of an Edeka supermarket in 1989, because East Germans who have recently breached the wall head straight for West German supermarkets like Edeka in Hamburg. They marvel at the productive capacities of capitalism and the ability that it has to provide such modest but very important things as, did they buy there? For example, olive oil. They actually bought party hats. And as we all have learned now, they bought coffee. So coffee, the old East German elite who had believed the people could have be satisfied with philosophy, athletics, TV programs about farming are hounded actually out of office. And not everything is as positively furious. If we look to Seattle in 1999, the World Trade Organization, a capitalist body dedicated to removing protection from industry and liberalizing markets, gets together for its next round of talks. So 10 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall and after a decade of unprecedented economic growth. But through the mood of politicians is upbeat, hundreds of thousands of anti-capitalist protesters have gathered to call an end to the inequities of global capitalism. The complaints are strikingly similar to those made by Jesus Christ, as I mentioned in the very early beginnings of this talk. This should give you a sense of how people felt. Let me read that out. Capitalism doesn't look after the producers, and capitalism downgrades the important spiritual ends of life for the sake of hamburgers, unsustainable cheap clothes, and garish distracting mass media. We could make a perfect transition to 2015. This kind of criticism probably hasn't changed since in 2015, Apple Computers officially became the largest corporation in the world. It's a giant success story. And I'm sure you remember that it turned out that Apple are indirectly responsible for the suffering and abuse of workers in the supply chain in China by the Foxconn Corporation. And with the launch of Apple Watch, which is a gadget that seems to have no particular urgent purpose, questions are once again raised about why are we exhausting ourselves and our planet for ends that are out of proportion with the costs they impose on all of us. So the big question is, who does a company serve? And finally, this is what happened after nearly 50 years. The answer was actually shareholders. The purpose is for shareholders. But in 2019, influential leaders from around the world issued grand statements at Davos, and they threw their weight behind something called stakeholder capitalism. More than 600 companies declared that companies exist to serve groups beyond their shareholders. They are accountable to customers, employees, suppliers, and communities, so not only to shareholders anymore. And let's look at a statement to give you a glimpse on their thinking. Hopefully the video works. I only have one video in here. So let's see if the sound works.
And maybe somewhere we derailed a little bit that we thought making money is the real goal of the economy, where the real goal is to live happily here all together. And if we see how much problems we create with the oceans, with our climate, with our scarce raw materials, we are somewhere derailing. And it is just good business sense as well to take care of your environment, because nobody will remain successful in a world that falls apart.
Okay, I could say that I might be biased already by the looks of people like this person, but probably the big question is like, what happens now? And this was 2019, and with all the things that I've stated out in the beginning. So what is happening now? And I think it was quite a powerful statement that we have just heard. And let me sketch out and share some thoughts, personal thoughts, and give you a framework where you can build upon probably throughout the next days, or later on you can use it as well. So how could this evolve? And the first thing, was there a question? No. So the first thing is, let me explain the difference between equality and equity. And equity is not equal access to everyone. As you can see on the left-hand side, when we talk about equality, not everybody has the same needs. So just equalizing everyone and giving them the same thing probably doesn't help. And this is the difference between equality and equity. How can we actually give the things to stakeholders or to the people that they need in their particular circumstances? And if we sketch out yes, sorry. Yeah.
This is not very important, but I just want to share that. Just that people thought that's funny. My son wanted to change school, to go to an international public school this year, and had to do a test, an English test. And this picture was given to him, asking for his opinion. Which picture does he find better and why? And he came out and was offended that his private political opinion is asked to decide on his future of schooling. So sorry, go ahead.
No worries. You're welcome.
I say that for him, he probably understands that better.
And if we map out in that framework actually two different sides, I think the most extreme one would be on the left-hand side, which is business and as usual. And I don't have to actually explain you what that means, because most of the corporates right now in the world, they still act as business as usual. They are interested in driving and maximizing profits towards shareholders. And on the most extreme side, and that's not only because of initiatives like Black Lives Matter, etc., we're heading more towards a most equitable and open direction. So those are two extremes, and I still think that a shift to stakeholder capitalism, we actually made a huge move already from shareholder value towards stakeholder capitalism, as I stated out before. And if, again, more than 600 companies declared to serve groups beyond their shareholders, like customers, employees, suppliers, and communities, that's already a big, big step forward. But the question is, since I said this is more a future-looking approach here, where could we actually move forwards? And for me, a logical next step would be to develop the vehicle for external input. And these signs or solutions already exist. And let me give you a tangible example. Like, for example, if corporates already open themselves towards ideation towards others or crowdsourcing their processes to the outside world, and you could actually influence their processes and outcomes. That's something that I meant here. Unfortunately, A, there are not a lot of companies doing that, and B, this is where most of the companies stop. And the demand right now, what we see on the streets, is far more further out on the right-hand side towards the most equitable and open solution than this. So a logical next step is prioritizing deliberate inclusion. So what do I mean by that? You've probably heard a lot about CSR as a terminology. CSR are, let me explain the difference between corporate social justice, which is a reframing of CSR that centers the focus of any initiative or program on the measurable lived experiences of groups harmed and disadvantaged by society. So CSR is a self-regulated framework that has no legal or social obligation for corporations to actually create positive impact for the groups they purport to help. Corporate social justice is a framework regulated by the trust between a company and its employees, customers, shareholders, and the broader community it touches. To simplify that, because that's very abstract what I just said. CSR is typically like a department within an organization, most of the times very much hooked up to marketing and the likes, and they only focus on one tiny piece, and it's a siloed approach, while corporate social justice integrates the outside world on a company level. And this is quite new. If you just look up on the internet corporate social justice, it's quite a new term, and not a lot of companies are doing that or trying to jump into that right now. What fascinated me within the last year, since I met some of you, is the approach on democratizing decision-making. So this is quite radical in terms of the systems level change and power shift. And to give you an insight, this would be one highly recommended book from my side. It's by Posner and it's called Radical Markets, and it basically describes on how we could democratize the decision-making. Throughout the last remaining slides that I have in place, I wanted to go a little deeper and do a deeper dive into that one. So, as you probably know, we have, if you live in a democratic society, you actually have happily the right to vote. And we do that for political purposes. But in the regards of company decision-making or corporate decision-making, it's not that common. So there are, and there's a lot of text in here, because I wanted, when you receive the slides later on, I wanted you to read that in more detail, because this is crucial. Remember the story before, which is fine, but this is something to do a deeper dive into. So modern democracies have generally used one person, one vote in their elections and legislative processes. Corporates have sometimes adopted more voting mechanisms, like, for example, if they allow their employees to vote, you could even give your vote as a shareholder to somebody else on your own behalf. So as a shareholder, obviously, you have like a stock and you can vote. So there are more complicated, but arguably more democratic voting systems. Just dropping some names, there's proportional voting, ranked choice voting. All of them are super duper complicated. And instead, I want to focus on what I read in the book from Posner on radical markets, and it's called quadratic voting, how to pronounce anyway. And to make it as easy as possible, just imagine it's not only a shareholder who can vote, because shareholder means in the end that there's a lot of power on very few people. What quadratic voting does is it basically is a mixture of crowdsourcing and the typical shareholder process. So each one of us could actually get one vote for $1. And the difference is that someone who invests a lot of money, if you invest that large amount of money, the more you invest, the less voting power you get, or the more tricky it gets. So it grows exponentially. So we, as 10,000 people, could actually, for $1 or in exchange of a good, get 10,000 votes, which is super duper powerful. Instead, one large investor who would get or want the same amount of votes has to invest then 10 millions or even way more to get the same voting power. So that's the difference, that voting is up to everybody, and you kind of goes back to the equity part, that you democratize that process. And there are already, before you ask like, hey, is it fantasy or so? There are parts in Colorado where they actually used the quadratic voting as a political system and tested that out towards the citizens there. And their first approaches within companies, mostly around, because the background is more towards blockchain solutions. So there are a bunch of foundations who actually have a voting process where they should focus upon. So this is already somehow out there in the wild and not too much fantasy. And as a last slide, within the book, and there's a fantastic conference called Radical Markets, and you can get all the content for free in the internet as well. To go from quadratic voting to funding. So what if we could actually build a fund, and it's not only by one super duper rich person, but instead it's a mixture. It's a mixture of investments from corporates or individuals, and all of them could build that fund and have democratized voting power in the end. And this is something that is really, really a radical shift, as I described early on in the framework. And before I jump to a sentence, just that you have a look at it again. I mean, this is so much out, but this is heading towards what you see with the protests right now, power to the people. This is like a strong request, and we're heading towards there. It's taking a longer time, probably not. Everything gets accelerated right now, but there are several options already out there in the market. So let me close with one last slide, and it's a personal statement in my perception. Happy to disargue on that one. Let's don't shrink the role of a market, but instead expand it with the given models like quadratic funding or voting power. So I think it's still a crucial mechanism, and I'm happy to hear your thoughts on that, because I was walking quite rush through this one, but I wanted to pick your thoughts on that one as well.